We continue our discussion with Dr. Aaron Kheriaty about the calls for a COVID-19 amnesty and where the world risks heading if people are not held accountable for bad policies. Dr. Kheriaty is the former director of the Medical Ethics Program at the University of California, Irvine, and author of the book, The New Abnormal. We speak about the history of similar medical policies, including the use of eugenics and their ties to current globalist ideologies, the threats of mandatory vaccinations, and we look at where the technocratic agendas using COVID-19 risk taking the world. Yeah, so I want to go deeper into the agenda with you and this whole biomedical security state, and actually what it means. But before we get into that, let's talk a bit about, well, a few areas I want to cover. First of all, the eugenics movement, because as you mentioned, this whole thing did start with eugenics. And whether you're talking about what the Nazis did or even the experiments in the U.S. leading up to, what the Nazis did, you mentioned it's kind of the logical conclusion of the beginning of the whole eugenics movement. If we read Dinesh D'Souza's book, The Big Lie, he talks actually about how the Nazis not only borrowed a lot from the eugenics movement, but also even from the whole plantation system, both of which he says were, Democrat Party type things, where they were under the Democrats. But going into what's happening now, a lot of these people are also eugenicists, and when you start tying that together, it becomes very clear these are people working on the same ideology as the Nazis and as the people prior to that. I know Gates comes from a family of eugenicists, and he talks openly about reducing the human population, which is bizarre. We've of course, I think, had a reconciliation with the Nazi movement. We never had a reconciliation with the ideologies that influenced the Nazi movement. And I'm curious what your thoughts are. Maybe explain to our viewers a bit about, I guess, what was the eugenicist movement, and how has that movement evolved into what is happening now with the biomedical security state?
So the eugenics movement started in the late 19th and early 20th century. The term eugenics was coined by Sir Francis Galton, who was a first cousin of Charles Darwin. And Galton's idea was that rather than waiting for nature and the very slow, blind process of natural selection to improve human beings through an evolutionary process, we should take control of that process through selective breeding. Positive eugenics meaning encouraging the quote-unquote right kind of people to reproduce more, and negative eugenics discouraging or even prohibiting the quote-unquote wrong kind of people from reproducing. So this ideology, which was embraced by mainstream progressives in the United States, it was endorsed by major academics. The founder of Stanford University, David Starr Jordan, was a past president of the American Breeders Association. Viewers would be forgiven for thinking the American Breeders Association had something to do with dogs and horses. No, they were talking about selective breeding of human beings to improve the human genetic stock. The Rockefeller, Carnegie, Kellogg foundations were behind this. Several presidents and major politicians were behind the eugenics movement. It was mainstream sort of progressivism in the early 20th century in the United States. And it led to laws in 27 states permitting
Planned Parenthood. Yeah.
Planned Parenthood. Of course, Margaret Sanger was a key figure in the eugenics movement in the early 20th century. Something that, it was papered over for a long time, but even Planned Parenthood now has acknowledged that and taken her name off the billboard. Whether they've actually backed away from that ideology or not is another question. But even they have disavowed their founder for her association with the eugenics movement. And this permitted involuntary sterilization laws, which I talked about before. 60,000 people, I said hundreds of thousands, were involuntarily sterilized. The figure is actually 60,000 in the US, but then when Germany took up the same program and modeled their laws on our sterilization laws, they managed to sterilize 350,000 people. So just sort of taking the same principles and modeling their laws in the same way, they accelerated and sort of advanced the eugenics program to also include not just sterilizing people, which was done in the US, which was upheld, by the way, by the Supreme Court, infamous case, 1927, Buck v. Bell, in which the famous American jurist Oliver Wendell Holmes Jr., writing for the majority, said that the principle that allows for forced vaccination is wide enough to cover the cutting of the fallopian tubes. And then the infamous line, which is still in that Supreme Court decision that's never been officially overturned, 3 generations of imbeciles are enough. He was citing the Jacobson case from 1905 that permitted forced vaccination during the smallpox epidemic. We can get back to that case later, but there is a connection there between forced vaccination and involuntary sterilization in the United States in terms of legal precedent that was upheld by the Supreme Court. But the Germans took all that and accelerated it and took it to the next logical step, which was not just sterilizing people based on physical disabilities, mental disabilities, in many cases just simply poverty or criminality, and actually euthanizing them, actually killing them involuntarily. So it's another shocking but undeniable historical fact that the first people gassed in Nazi Germany in gas chambers were not the Jews. That came later. It was not some other ethnic minority. That came later. The first people gassed were mentally ill individuals. And the first gas chambers were located in psychiatric hospitals. And all of those people killed, each one of those deaths was signed off by a German physician, by a German psychiatrist. So medicine was deeply implicated in this eugenics program, both in the US and in Germany. Doctors were the ones signing off on involuntary sterilization as well. 1/3 of those cases occurred in my home state of California, and most of those were endorsed by the California State Psychiatric Hospital system, actually. So this stuff is in our history. It's a dark chapter of American history that is not typically taught in your high school American history courses or even your college American history courses. But it's something that Americans need to be aware of, because the eugenics movement got a bad name and sort of went underground after World War II. But it's emerging in new ways in terms of people looking at the ways in which biotechnologies can enhance human beings. The whole transhumanist movement is what I like to call microwaved eugenics, and I talk about the connection between the transhumanist movement and much of the sort of biomedical security model that we saw rolled out during COVID. I talk about that in chapter 3 of The New Abnormal. So what I try to do in the book is draw some historical lines between what happened in the 20th century and some of the horrors of the 20th century and some of the ideologies that are starting to reemerge today. Again, not because we've reached that level of human rights violation or atrocity, but because the underlying logic is the same. And if we don't want to go further down that road, if we want to arrest that process, we need to understand where this is going to go. And that's where the historical analogies can be very useful.
Now, I know some people would argue, well, it would never go that far. But you mentioned a few very important points, which is that the forced vaccination model beginning, or actually prior to the whole eugenics movement, was what was used to justify the eugenics movement. Now we see the forced vaccination model and the legal basis for it in the United States cropping up, ironically, by the same people many of whom still believe in eugenics, many of whom are deeply tied to it, including on an international level, like the United Nations and such. And they're voicing the same ideology that allowed for these abuses to take place previously. Now, one of the big things you mentioned in your book, and I know you've been talking about just in general, is the new, I guess we could call the new logical conclusion of eugenics, which is not just eugenics, I should say, but the new logical conclusion of the entire agenda around COVID-19. I'm not saying COVID-19 was made for this reason or released for this reason, but I am saying it's being used for this reason.
Yep.
Absolutely. And what you did in your book, and I'll tell you, your book is a necessary read, I think, to anybody, but it's horrifying. It's like nonfiction George Orwell, But Honestly, you helped answer one of my big questions, which is, and just briefly, we'll get into this. In New York City, for example, the Supreme Court declared that you mentioned earlier that some of the state workers need to have their jobs restored and need to be given back pay. And one of the bases written by the judge in that ruling from the Supreme Court of New York was that, the president of the United States, Biden, declared the pandemic was over. People can say he didn't mean what he said. What are they suggesting? He's not mentally fit? I don't know. But they can say he didn't mean what he said, but he said it. And if the pandemic is over and all the data does suggest it is over, then what do we still have these things for? And then they start rolling out new policies. It's suggesting that COVID is no longer about COVID-19. COVID is about something else. And you're arguing, well, showing, I think, not even just argue, you're showing what is being built. So tell us now, what is being built with this agenda?
So this phrase I use in the subtitle, the rise of the biomedical security state. What do I mean by the biomedical security state? The simplest way to understand it is that it's the welding together of three different things. First of all, an increasingly militarized public health apparatus. And I talk in the book about the 20-year history of the militarization of public health and what I mean by that. So militarized public health welded to digital technologies of surveillance and control, which have really only been available since the invention of the iPhone in 2007, right? These devices that allow for the careful tracking of movements, the gathering of massive amounts of data from basically every individual, at least every adult or older child who owns one of these smartphones. And both of those, the apparatus of the digital infrastructure, the apparatus of the militarized public health, are backed up by the police powers of the state. So I think what we actually developed during the pandemic, or what's been in development for 20 years and was rolled out opportunistically during the pandemic, is not just a novel method for trying to control an infectious disease, but really a novel paradigm of governance, a paradigm of governance that rests upon the legal mechanism of the declared state of emergency, and that then entails the need to sort of jump from one declared emergency to the next in order to expand or maintain those emergency powers and to gain additional levels of surveillance and control over large populations. So part of what this entails is not only identifying new novel pathogen threats. We saw the attempt recently to convert monkeypox, which is only a risk for a very small percentage of the population engaged in certain types of behaviors. But there was an attempt to try to frame that as potentially dangerous to everyone. That didn't really take hold, but we're going to see more of that, more of the latest variant. There's the framing of the upcoming influenza season in terms of a public health crisis or a public health emergency, where flu season in the past has never been sort of approached in that way. But also we see the attempt to redefine other issues as public health issues. I talk about two examples in the book. The first is during the initial lockdowns, we saw a group of 1,200 public health officials sign an open public letter declaring racism to be a public health emergency. So we needed lockdown supposedly to deal with the virus, but we needed a carve out to allow for large public gatherings during the George Floyd protests and the BLM riots, because racism was a public health crisis. The second issue that's been redefined over the last 3 years from an environmental issue to a public health issue is climate change. So if you look in the last several years at the headlines around climate change, and just bracketing for a moment the controversies and disputes about climate change and whether and how to deal with it, climate change used to be framed in terms of ecology, in terms of the environment, in terms of the biosphere. Now it's framed in terms of harms to human health and harms to public health. And there are proposals now to declare climate change not just a public health issue, but a public health crisis. So serious politicians in power, serious academics with appointments at Ivy League universities have put forward proposals to use, for example, rolling lockdowns to deal with climate change, or lockdowns to deal with the energy crisis in Europe. So public health proved to be a very useful, health and safety proved to be a very useful means of getting the population to do what health officials and other people in power wanted them to do. And I think if we've adopted this new paradigm of governance, which I argue that we have, at least there are very strong forces at work in the public and private spheres that benefit from this. There are strong forces pushing us in the direction of a kind of biosecurity paradigm of governance that entails inventing and reinventing new crises to maintain and fuel this biosecurity regime on an ongoing basis.
And the implications of that are really concerning because, drawing comparisons again to the Nazis and their declaration that, in their case, that the Jews were a threat to the body politic, that, an illness essentially is the way they tried framing it, which they used as a legal justification to do what they did. If we take what the Nazis did and compare it to what's happening now, and you mentioned they're expanding this idea of public health crisis as being things that are not about viruses or diseases, but conceptual things like racism, tangible like physical things such as gun violence. They're trying to say as a public health crisis. That even something like, for example, global warming, which would mean they could regulate carbon, and everything, including you and I, are made of carbon. Yeah. And the frightening thing is they found a way to use this Trojan horse of public health crisis to get these additional powers to let them override constitutional rights. We see now the setting of the stage as you've been discussing, and the logical conclusion I think seems very far off. But what you're saying is they're actually working on technologies and systems that would create something. What does it look like if they create whatever it is they're building?
Yeah. So I think the next steps in the advance of the biosecurity regime, and the book is not so much a retrospective on the pandemic, but I wanted the new abnormal to be forward-looking and to ask the question, okay, where is this going next? And I talk about two key things that are actually not new technologies in development. They're technologies that are already available. They just haven't been rolled out and adopted on a mass scale. The first is digital IDs tied to biometric data. So a digital ID stored in the cloud somewhere that is tied into your Face ID, your iris scan, your fingerprint, and eventually with the use of wearable or implantable devices tied into biometric data under the skin, your heart rate, your blood pressure, the ability to sort of assess at any given moment what is your emotional state, and so forth. These things are already available. They're already in use. The Clear system is one concrete example that I talk about. People may have seen this going through the TSA line at the airport. This is a private corporation that's apparently partnered with the government to allow you to jump forward in the security line, for the sake of convenience, if you buy into their system, which involves precisely what I just described. That system also happens to be tied to your credit score. And there's a push to tie it to your COVID vaccine pass in places that have vaccine passports. So a kind of integrated system that will involve, again, the relinquishing of enormous amounts of private data to both public and private entities that will be able to access it. And the second step, which will be tied into this digital ID, is the central bank digital currencies. China already has the digital yuan that was rolled out during the Beijing Olympics. They showed they could not only force this CBDC, central bank digital currency, on their own population, but it was exported internationally because everyone who went and participated in the Beijing Olympics from various countries around the world had to do all of their purchases and transactions there using this app on their phone, which is, by the way, now tracking their financial information and has access to their bank account and so forth. But this push toward a centralized digital currencies as opposed to a decentralized blockchain type currency like Bitcoin will allow for the government and whatever private entities it contracts with to track each and every one of your transactions and to essentially nudge and eventually control your behavior by controlling the ways in which you use your currency. And in fact, I explain in the book why a digital dollar, which the feds are talking about piloting next year, why a digital dollar is not the same thing as a dollar bill in your pocket. Let's suppose, for example, that you get a tax rebate. The government gives you $1,000 because you had another child or whatever. So you get some money back from the government in the form of a digital dollar, a central bank digital currency controlled by the feds. Well, they could attach conditions to the use of that quote unquote currency. They could say you have to spend this in the next 9 months, and then it's going to disappear if you don't. They can say you have to spend this only on green energy, or you can't spend this on disfavorable industries or entities. You can't make a donation to the Epoch Times or whatever, people spreading quote unquote misinformation. Well, so what you have in your digital wallet is not actually a dollar bill. What you have in your digital wallet, it's not a fungible, it doesn't function like real currency. It's a temporary voucher, right? It's a carrot and stick that can be used to nudge your market-related behavior. And the real problem with this comes when if we eventually end up in a cashless society where the digital ID, central bank digital currency, biometric system is in place, it may get to the point where you're actually locked out of certain markets based on, a bad social credit type score, a bad ESG score that says, your carbon footprint is 25% above other white males similarly situated in Orange County, Dr. Cariotti. And, we tried to nudge you to convert over to an electric only vehicle by increasing your gas tax, and you still haven't done so. So, some algorithm in the cloud or some person is just going to push a button and you won't be able to buy gas anymore, right? Or Cariotti, if you keep spreading misinformation on Crossroads, we're going to lock you out of, your ability to engage in certain market transactions that would allow you a platform to continue talking to the public or whatever. So, we talked about totalitarianism earlier in the program. These are mechanisms of surveillance and control that Hitler and Stalin could only have dreamed of. I mean, they're the technologies available to the totalitarian systems of the past to monitor, surveil, and control their populations were rudimentary and infantile compared to technologies that, as I said, this is not futuristic sci-fi. These are technologies that are already available. They just haven't been adopted on a widespread scale. So I think it's important for Americans to understand the dangers here and to categorically reject digital IDs, central bank digital currencies. In the epilogue to the book, I wrote a sort of quasi-fictional epilogue called Seattle 2030, where I describe what the world may look like in 8 years if these technologies are adopted. And basically what I said at the beginning of that in a footnote is all the technologies described in here are already available. I'm not making anything up. I'm just explaining what a world where we've embraced these technologies could look like. Not in the distant future, 20, 30 years from now, but in the not so distant future. It's not hard for people to imagine 7, 8 years down the road. And so these things are coming down the pike, I think, very quickly. And they're one of those things that most Americans, again, are just not aware of. And they'll be pitched to us on the basis of, with a kind of velvet glove approach on the basis of convenience. Skip ahead to the security line in the airport. Oh, you forgot your passport. You forgot your wallet. You forgot your driver's license at home. And so you're going to miss your flight. Oh, don't worry. We'll We'll just grab your iris scan, verify that it's you, do a background check on you, make sure that you haven't spent money on the wrong things recently, and then you can get your flight. So it'll be sold on the basis of convenience and the sort of frictionless ideal of Silicon Valley. But in fact, we're going to give away much more than we gain if we embrace these new technologies. And so the book, as you said, I didn't set out to write a kind of nonfiction Orwellian dystopia. I set out to figure out what has happened to us over the last 3 years. How do we explain what was done and why? And as I dug in, it became very clear to me that what I describe in the book is, in fact, the clearest and most cogent explanation for what happened over the last 3 years. And that also pointed me in the direction of, what's next in this process? Where is this going next? And as I look around, it becomes clear that these new mechanisms are already being rolled out, and these proposals are already being floated by the powers that be. And so, as kind of sobering as the book might be, I think it's an urgent and necessary kind of wake-up call for people to understand that, if we don't sort of get a handle on what's going on, COVID is just the beginning. Many of the specific pandemic policies have been rolled back, but that entire infrastructure is still in place, just waiting for the next declared crisis or the next declared public health emergency to advance in terms of next steps.
You give some pretty strong warnings, and of course, you set out to really, give this warning to people. Given that, what do people do about it? Like, what can be done to stop this future from taking place?
So I have some proposals in the last chapter, which I hope is a more hopeful part of the book. Some clear policy proposals. I talked about one of those proposals earlier in the program in terms of setting appropriate constitutional checks and balances, judicial legislative review on the state of emergency. I think we have to get a handle on that legal mechanism that allows for the suspension of certain laws, legal protections, constitutional rights, health and safety measures, at the CDC, the FDA, and so forth. Our public health institutions require very deep reforms. Probably don't have time in today's interview to get down on, into the weeds in terms of how to reform CDC, FDA, NIH. But I have some proposals in the book, and other thoughtful minds are certainly looking into this. I think there'll be a lot of projects in the next year or two, coming into the presidential election of 2024, trying to devise policy solutions to reform our public health agencies, which have been largely captured by corporate interests and are no longer serving the needs of the American people. Awareness on the part of the American people of what happened to us is going to be difficult. There's a lot of sort of psychological defenses at work. I think a lot of people would rather just forget about COVID and move on. But for all the reasons that we've discussed, I think that's problematic. So people can begin by having conversations, by sharing information. I argue in the last chapter of the book that part of this biosecurity regime involved separating people. The sort of biosecurity version of totalitarianism is a totalitarianism of disintegration before it's a totalitarianism of domination. What I mean by that is, look at what happened with lockdowns and social distancing. People were separated from one another. They were forced to do all of their communication and interaction from behind a screen. And when you're behind a screen, the Googles, the Facebooks, the Twitters of the world can and have been controlling the flow of information that you receive. So it's harder for alternative views to be aired when people can't gather around the water cooler, when people don't encounter one another face to face, at the kids' soccer game, or the kids' scout meeting, or at the neighborhood block party, or at the book club that you joined, where you get some friends together to read something interesting and talk about it. these, what Edmund Burke called these little platoons of civil society, are the key antidote for an authoritarian, tech-enabled biosecurity state. That none of this could have happened without Americans' passive acceptance, often induced, under a condition of fear, passive acceptance of things that prior to the pandemic would have sounded insane to them. So beginning to wake up from that sleepwalking trance and to say, no, there's certain things that I will never relinquish, even during a crisis, even during wartime, even during a pandemic. My ability to be with my loved one when he or she is dying, for example, would be one of those basic human goods that should never be relinquished. The ability to see one another face to face, the locus of communication, which was covered by masks, which eventually started being called face coverings, which I think is a very, very strange turn of phrase. I don't call this a chest covering. I don't call my boxer shorts genital coverings. Why a face covering? It's a strange term. Social distancing is a strange term, as I point out in the book. A medical term would have been something like physical distancing. But social distancing suggests a sort of new paradigm for interpersonal or social or societal interactions.
Yeah, distancing socially, yeah.
Yeah, so I mean, just at a small scale, yeah, you may not have a microphone, you may not be in a position of power where you're making policy, but start meeting with people face to face and refuse to give up the right to meet with others face to face. Take off that mask, overcome your fear. The cloth and surgical masks, we now know, are not effective at stopping transmission of a respiratory virus. In fact, we knew that before COVID, but it's only been confirmed during this pandemic. If we act individually, we'll get squashed. But if we collectively and in small groups start getting engaged, start getting involved, and start collectively standing up, a group of half a dozen people at the office standing up against an unjust mandate that your employer puts forward has been very effective at stopping some of those mandates. One person standing up has not been effective. So reach out to others, connect with like-minded people, share information. And this is how democracy worked. Alexis de Tocqueville, the great student of American democracy in Democracy in America, talks about these small groups acting at the local level. These are the real strength of civil society in the United States, and this is what makes the constitutional system in the United States viable and functional. When we lose that, even if the Constitution is still there on paper, we've changed the way in which our entire society is functioning. And I think we saw in the last 3 years what is the sort of early results of that process. But I think it's important for us to realize that process is going to continue unless and until we push back. And there's a lot that people can do to push back. We saw also, one of the things people realized during the pandemic is we're so focused on national politics, presidential, Senate, debates and races. But most of the things that impact your day-to-day life are happening at the local level. So even in California, where we had, a very sort of authoritarian statewide response to COVID, there were some places that were much worse and some places that were much better than others. So I live in Orange County, and LA, just 40 miles up the street, was much more draconian for much longer, not because of the governor, but because of the mayor and the unelected county board of supervisors, or the elected county board of supervisors, but the unelected public health officers. So state politics and national politics are important, but local politics are extremely important. And petty tyrants on the school board and at the county level and at the city level or the level of a small town also wield enormous influence over your life. So I think one of the things we've seen is more and more parents getting involved in running for school board, more and more local, professional leaders running for local office to try to, bring some sensible and balanced ideas to these public health issues. That's a very positive development, and I think we need to get back to the sort of traditional American understanding that national politics is pretty remote from our everyday lives. And so, politics at the county and city and town level, or even at the level of my child's public or private school, those are really important as well for our health and human flourishing.
Hey, Dr. Aaron Kheriaty, thank you so much for being here.
Thanks, Josh.